General Hospital spoilers reveal that Liesl's shocking revelation did not come as a fleeting suspicion or a passing comment, it arrived as a bombshell. A carefully calculated conclusion built upon years of scientific knowledge, personal trauma, and psychological observation. Her return to Port Charles, already charged with emotion, quickly escalated into a critical turning point when she finally chose to confide in Nina what she had uncovered. With a calm but unnerving conviction, Liesl revealed that Drew, once thought to be a man recovering from trauma, had not only retained the mental programming inflicted on him through Victor Cassidy's twisted tarot system but had gone further. He had mastered it. He had learned to wield the same psychological tools that once imprisoned his mind. And now, Drew had allegedly turned those tools on someone else, Willow. To the outside world. Willow's transformation seemed like the evolution of a woman reborn, someone who had faced illness, near death, and emotional loss, and emerged with a newfound clarity. But to Liesl, the change was too precise, too measured. Willow's behavior mirrored patterns that Liesl had witnessed in the most dangerous forms of psychological control, patterns she once studied in WSB experimentation chambers. Patterns she saw in victims who had been rewired at their core. Liesl, who had once played a part in such experiments and later spent years trying to atone for those sins, instantly recognized what others missed. Her sharp eyes caught the subtle suppression of personality in Willow, her dulled emotional responses, the loyalty that bordered on obsession, the abrupt abandonment of former convictions, and most disturbingly, the blind reverence for Drew. For months, Liesl had suspected something was deeply wrong. The relationship between Drew and Willow had never felt natural, especially given their history and age difference. But now, with Willow seemingly detached from her former self and exhibiting symptoms of subconscious reprogramming, Liesl could no longer dismiss the possibility. The horror wasn't just that Willow had changed, it was that she had been changed. And the instrument of that change was something Liesl knew intimately, the tarot deck. The same deck used to control Drew during his captivity on Cassadine Island. Those cards, once thought to be destroyed, were not only still in circulation, they were in Drew's possession. And if Drew had been trained, either consciously or through deeply embedded triggers, to use them as psychological anchors, it was entirely plausible that he had transferred those techniques to Willow. Liesl's theory didn't rely on guesswork. It relied on behavioral markers and neurological clues she had spent a lifetime decoding. She noticed that Willow exhibited signs of suggestibility during conversations. Moments when her tone shifted or her gaze fixed in a trance-like stare, especially when Drew was present. She noticed that Willow had started mimicking Drew's patterns of speech, repeating phrases he often used, even adopting his views with unnerving precision. These were not signs of mutual growth in a relationship, these were signs of imprinting. Signs of deep behavioral synchronization achieved only through subconscious coercion. And as Liesl unraveled more, her fear intensified. If Drew had truly become the vessel of his former programming, the implications stretched far beyond Willow. Drew, in essence, might be an unaware carrier of a psychological virus, a man who had been conditioned to carry out control and pass it on, under the illusion of healing and unity. The fact that he appeared loving and supportive only made the manipulation more dangerous. He believed in what he was doing. He believed that this version of Willow, docile, devoted, emotionally numb, was the real her. And if no one intervened, he would continue reinforcing her programming, believing it was love. Liesl's horror reached its peak when she retrieved her own tarot deck, one of the few remaining original sets, stored for decades as evidence of the WSB's most controversial work. She laid out the cards as she had done in the past, studying them not for divination, but for the symbols and psychological patterns they carried. She knew the cards had been designed not to predict fate but to shape it, to subtly condition a person's sense of identity, fear, loyalty, and trust through repeated visual exposure and suggestion. Each card, each image, had a coded emotional trigger, capable of embedding commands beneath layers of consciousness. And if Drew had used these tools on Willow, even inadvertently, the damage might already be deeply rooted. Liesl knew she couldn't stay silent. She had seen how these patterns led to complete psychological collapse, to loss of self, to irreversible detachment from reality. If Willow wasn't already lost to the programming, she was dangerously close. And the scariest part was, Willow didn't resist it, because she didn't know it was happening. That, Liesl understood, was the most powerful kind of control, the kind that makes the victim believe they are free. The truth sickened her. Liesl had once been an architect of mind control, a tool for regimes and organizations who saw people as experiments. She had spent years undoing her own legacy, and now, standing in front of her family again, she was watching history repeat itself, this time with Drew as the unwilling manipulator and Willow as the unknowing subject. She couldn't let it go on. She had to act, not just to protect Willow, but to prevent the spread of this silent contagion that had already consumed too many lives. She told Nina everything, detailing each step of her theory, laying out the psychological markers and evidence. Nina was horrified but hesitant, unsure if the situation was as extreme as Liesl claimed. But Liesl didn't need consensus, she needed action. She resolved that Willow must be separated from Drew immediately, and a full psychological deprogramming needed to begin. She wasn't naive, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The programming was emotional as much as cognitive. Breaking it would require unraveling layers of identity, confronting buried triggers, and forcing Willow to see the cage she had been trained not to notice. But there was no alternative. Liesl couldn't watch another generation fall to the same mechanisms that had once destroyed so many. And if she had to be the villain in their story to save Willow from the ghost that now haunted her mind, she was ready. Because what haunted Liesl most was not just the memory of tarot cards or control. It was seeing Willow smile through numbness, love through obedience, and live through a reality shaped by someone else's hand. Willow's soul had been rewritten. And if no one fought to return it to her, she would never be whole again. Liesl had failed many before. She would not fail Willow. Not this time. Not again. Liesl stood still, her eyes sharp and voice laced with urgency as she delivered the weight of her discovery to Nina. A report not of speculation, but of a psychological nightmare unfolding in real time. What she conveyed was not a theory. It was a diagnosis of horror. Willow was no longer herself. And Drew was not just the man by her side, he was the instrument of her undoing. Liesl's words echoed in the room like broken glass falling onto tile, each one sharper than the last. Nina listened in stunned silence, but with every revelation, she felt her chest tighten. This wasn't just about a strained relationship or emotional change, it was about manipulation, cold, clinical, and dangerously sophisticated. Liesl explained that Drew, once a victim of Cassidy's tarot-based brainwashing, had unknowingly or perhaps instinctively inherited the same techniques. The same cards once used to fracture his identity had become tools he now possessed. And if Liesl was right, and she was certain she was, Drew had transferred that fractured energy. That silent programming, onto Willow. What terrified Liesl the most wasn't the method, it was how subtle the shift had been. It wasn't a sudden change, but a slow erosion. One that rewrote Willow from the inside out. Her emotional compliance, the way she mirrored Drew's tone, her soft devotion that felt less romantic and more conditioned, it was all too familiar. Liesl had seen this before in laboratories, in fieldwork, in war zones, in women who didn't know they had been rewritten. And now Willow. The once fiery and intuitive woman who had fought death and chosen her family again and again, was no longer present in her own body. She had become a reflection of Drew's damage. For Liesl, it was déjà vu layered in dread. She was watching someone be rewritten in front of her eyes, and if no one stopped it, Willow would eventually disappear entirely beneath the illusion of happiness. Nina, shaken and furious, could barely process the scope of what she was hearing. Her heart pounded with disbelief, yet every instinct told her that Liesl was right. The changes in Willow hadn't made sense. The emotional distance, the mechanical smiles. The way she seemed to avoid conflict with Drew even when it was warranted, it all now clicked into place with sickening clarity. Nina had wanted so badly to believe her daughter had found peace. That Drew had saved her, that the cancer was behind them and love had healed everything. But what if peace wasn't peace at all? What if it was programming? What if healing had been replaced by hollow obedience? This realization wasn't just painful, it was maddening. Nina, who had already lost so much time with Willow, now stood on the verge of losing her again, this time not to illness or resentment, but to a man who may not even know what he's doing. Liesl warned her, the conditioning might not be deliberate. Drew could be an unknowing carrier of the very same triggers that once enslaved him. And that made it worse. Because he believed in this love. He believed he was doing good. He believed Willow was truly choosing him. And so did everyone else, except for Liesl, who saw the truth too clearly, and now Nina, who could no longer deny what was unraveling. Together, they faced a terrifying truth: Willow had to be deprogrammed. She had to be brought back from whatever depths she had been submerged into. But time was working against them. The longer Willow remained inside the bubble Drew had created around her, the harder it would be to break the trance. Liesl emphasized that every day spent under that influence only solidified the illusion, making the programming stronger, more permanent. Nina, whose instinct had always been to protect her daughter at all costs, now faced the hardest decision of all. She had to act, not as a mother who hoped things would get better, but as a woman who had to shatter the surface to reach what remained beneath. This wasn't just about love anymore. This was about psychological rescue. This was about freeing Willow from a prison no one could see. It was about peeling back the layers of affection, habit, and trauma until the real woman underneath could breathe again. Liesl made it clear, Drew and Willow must be separated. Willow needed to be reminded of who she was before Drew. She needed space, medical intervention, mental clarity. She needed to remember what it meant to want something that wasn't fed to her through invisible threads of manipulation. The weight of the task was enormous, but neither woman flinched. Nina's fear had turned into steel. Liesl's horror had turned into purpose. And in that moment, they understood that saving Willow would require more than confrontation. It would require dismantling an entire illusion, one built from months of emotional programming and subconscious suggestion. They would have to navigate through Willow's false peace and crack it open. They would have to make her uncomfortable, angry, maybe even hateful, because that was how truth clawed its way back through conditioning. Liesl's plan was methodical, clinical. Nina's was emotional, fierce. But together, they had clarity. And that was more than anyone else in Port Charles had. This shift marked one of the most dangerous adjustments to ever surface in their world. Because it wasn't a villain with a gun. Or a virus sweeping the hospital halls. It was invisible. Quiet. Crawling through hearts and thoughts like a parasite. And it lived in the idea that Willow was happy. That she was safe. That she had found love. But the reality was that she had been subtly stripped of choice, fed identity through filtered eyes. Drew's hands, once held out in rescue, now held the very key to her psychological chains. The obsession wasn't Drew's. It was the system now buried inside him, reshaped by years of captivity and trauma. Bleeding out into Willow through intimacy, repetition, and care masked as control. And the longer no one said anything, the longer everyone called it love, the deeper Willow fell. Liesl and Nina would not let her fall further. They were ready to pull her back. They were ready to destroy the illusion. Even if it meant exposing Drew. Even if it meant being hated. Even if it meant tearing apart the life Willow thought she wanted. Because that life was not hers, it was built for her. And it was time to take it back. The ceremony was supposed to mark a new beginning, a celebration of survival and love between Drew and Willow. Every guest at the lavishly decorated hall expected vows of commitment and unity. A joyful milestone for two people who had supposedly overcome tragedy to find each other. But beneath the polished silverware, silk flowers, and whispered congratulations, something dark pulsed beneath the surface, a secret so explosive it would rip through the illusion and turn Drew's carefully constructed wedding day into a stage for public unraveling. And at the center of this storm stood Liesl, a woman who had lived through horrors, studied human manipulation, and now held the terrifying knowledge that could end everything. She had waited. Calculated, and now the moment had come. She would reveal Drew's secret right in front of everyone, in the very moment he planned to claim Willow as his bride. It would be her act of war, and her gift of salvation. Liesl had watched for weeks, quietly confirming her worst suspicions. She had seen Willow drift further from herself, too obedient, too serene. Too empty behind the eyes. It wasn't love. It was programming. A hollowing out. Liesl, drawing on her WSB experience, recognized the pattern immediately. What made it worse was knowing that the very man everyone saw as Willow's savior, Drew, was in fact the one keeping her imprisoned. Not physically, but mentally. He was using the same psychological conditioning tools that had once been used on him, tarot-based brainwashing, subtle triggers, emotional anchoring. And now, Willow was the latest victim in a legacy of invisible violence. But Liesl hadn't come to merely observe. She had come to stop it. And she would do it publicly, permanently. She had planned every step. Every word, every interruption. The moment Drew began to speak his vows, Liesl would rise, interrupt the ceremony, and expose everything. She knew she would be hated, accused of cruelty. Maybe even labeled unstable. But she didn't care. This wasn't about reputation. It was about rescuing a woman whose soul had been rewritten. Liesl knew the cost of silence. She had paid it before. She wouldn't do it again. As Drew stood beside Willow at the altar, his hand reaching for hers, Liesl's pulse quickened. She saw how still Willow stood, her expression fixed. Her body unnaturally poised. She was a puppet on display, and Drew, whether knowingly or not, was pulling the strings. That was when Liesl stepped forward. Her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. What followed was not chaos, it was surgical. Liesl didn't shout. She presented the truth with clarity and control. Laying out her case like an expert delivering a clinical diagnosis. She spoke of the tarot triggers Drew had once been programmed with. The signs that he had not only retained that programming but had internalized it. She explained how Willow's psychological changes aligned perfectly with classical brainwashing profiles. Reduced emotional range, suggestibility, dependency on a central figure. Liesl then disclosed that she had retrieved the original tarot cards, still encoded with the same symbolic programming, and had tested them subtly around Willow. The reactions confirmed everything. Willow wasn't free. She was conditioned. Gasps filled the room. Drew froze. Willow blinked, dazed, uncertain, her hand trembling in his. And that's when Liesl made her final move. She announced that she had developed a deprogramming protocol, a sequence of visual and auditory cues capable of disrupting the neural loops created by the tarot conditioning. She hadn't just come to destroy a wedding, she had come to rescue a mind. She had studied Willow's triggers, observed the psychological architecture, and designed a treatment that could bring her back. The crowd was stunned into silence, torn between disbelief and horror. Some demanded Liesl leave, others began to whisper, but the most profound reaction came from Willow herself. Something inside her shifted. A flicker of confusion, then fear, then a sudden gasp as if she were waking up underwater. It was working. The truth had begun to puncture the fog. Liesl had shattered the illusion. The programming, already destabilized by the stress of the moment, began to fracture under the weight of reality. Drew stepped back, pale, defensive. He stammered. Denied, tried to refocus attention, but the damage was done. Willow was no longer responding the way she had before. Her voice cracked as she asked why she felt dizzy. Why she couldn't remember the last few months clearly, why she had isolated from everyone she once loved. It wasn't an awakening, it was a psychic explosion. And it proved everything Liesl had said. The wedding was over. Guests began leaving. Some cried, others shouted. But Liesl stood firm, holding Willow gently, calmly explaining what had happened, offering her a path out. The damage to Drew's reputation was irreversible. He wasn't just a groom left at the altar, he was now a man at the center of a psychological scandal. Someone who had possibly transferred his own trauma into another without even realizing it. But for Liesl, none of that mattered as much as the tremor in Willow's voice when she finally looked up and whispered, "Help me." That moment was the answer to every doubt. It proved that Willow had been buried alive inside herself, and now she was clawing her way out. Liesl had delivered a truth that many would hate her for. But she had also ignited the first flicker of freedom in a woman who had been quietly suffocating in the illusion of love. This wasn't just the collapse of a wedding, it was the unraveling of a silent system of control, a public unveiling of how trauma can become contagious when left unchecked. The obsession now wasn't about romance, it was about rescue. It was about undoing what had been silently done in secret. And Liesl, who had once contributed to the machinery of manipulation, had now become its fiercest enemy. The nightmare wasn't over, but the silence had been broken. The programming had been identified. And with Liesl's knowledge, the path to freedom had begun. Port Charles would never forget the day Drew's wedding turned into a psychological battlefield. But Willow would remember it as the day her mind began to return home. Willow had spent months locked inside herself, walking through the world like a shadow wearing her own skin. Smiles came too easily, but never reached her eyes. Her voice was calm. Her words obedient, her emotions muted, none of it felt real, not even to her. Somewhere deep within, buried beneath layers of false memories, implanted loyalties, and distorted affections. She knew something was wrong. She had known it for a long time, but had lacked the language, the clarity, the strength to face it. Until now. Until her world cracked open at the altar. Until the fog lifted, and she saw Drew for what he truly was, not her partner, not her savior, but her captor. And what followed was not just awakening, but rebellion. For the first time in what felt like forever, Willow began to fight back. The transformation began slowly. In the hours after Liesl's public intervention, Willow was shaken but quiet. The guests had gone, the wedding venue stood abandoned like a forgotten lie, and Drew paced the empty hall with trembling hands, trying to rationalize the chaos. But Willow no longer responded with passive understanding. She watched him with cold detachment, her mind churning as fragments of memories, sensations, and contradictions surfaced. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Her body remembered what her mind had been forced to forget. The dizziness, the nightmares, the triggered responses to certain words or gestures. Liesl's words had broken the spell, and now Willow was staring down the man she had once called her future and seeing only danger. The truth hit like a violent wave. Drew had conditioned her. Whether consciously or not, he had used psychological tools, tools he once endured himself, to mold her. Through repetition, isolation, and soft influence disguised as affection, he had erased her will. The love she thought she gave had never truly been hers to offer. It had been shaped, pulled, programmed into her. And that realization became the fuel for her next act, revenge not out of cruelty, but liberation. She would no longer be silent. She would no longer protect him. She would expose him. In the days that followed, Willow began building her case. Every message, every recorded conversation, every altered memory she could piece together from journals and data backed up on Drew's devices. She stopped hiding her questions. She confronted doctors who had signed off on her treatments, people Drew had manipulated into covering for him. She confronted family members who had been kept at a distance under the guise of protecting her recovery. What she found was terrifying, a trail of small, intentional choices that created the perfect cage. Drew had controlled her schedule, filtered who she could talk to, encouraged her to depend solely on him. He fed her half-truths, buried her doubts in affection, and called it love. But Willow wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. A new fire had been lit inside her, not just to survive but to reclaim. And that fire grew with each step she took back toward herself. She stopped answering Drew's calls. She changed the locks. She moved into a separate residence and publicly released a statement through the hospital press that she was taking legal and medical steps to challenge her guardianship over herself. The message was clear: she was reclaiming autonomy. When Drew tried to visit her, to plead, to gaslight, she stood firm. She looked him in the eyes and told him he had no power over her anymore. That the version of Willow he built was dead. That the real Willow was back, and she was not his to mold. The confrontation was brutal, with Drew oscillating between desperation and denial. But Willow didn't flinch. Because now she remembered everything. Every moment of doubt he smoothed over. Every hesitation he framed as trauma. Every time he convinced her that silence was strength. But she was done being silent. She was done being controlled. She wasn't his partner. She was his survivor. In a bold move, Willow filed charges, not just personal ones, but legal and medical investigations into psychological coercion and abuse. She had support from Liesl, from Nina, and eventually from others who saw the same disturbing patterns in Drew's behavior. The town was shaken. The once celebrated hero was now under intense scrutiny, not as a criminal in the traditional sense, but as a perpetrator of psychological assault. And Willow, once his supposed trophy of redemption, had become his undoing. Her public testimony during the review hearings was the breaking point. With clarity and chilling composure, she described the subtle unraveling of her identity. The way her thoughts shifted, the way her fears were redirected, the way her love had been engineered. And then, she said the words that made every person in that room stop breathing: he didn't love me. He rewrote me. And I'm here to erase his work. It was not just a condemnation, it was a resurrection. Willow was no longer the woman broken by leukemia, by loss, by abandonment. She was the storm rising from manipulation, the survivor of a quiet war no one else saw coming. And in dismantling Drew's control over her, she dismantled something far more terrifying, the myth that emotional abuse must come with bruises. She showed the world what psychological invasion looked like, and she fought it with something stronger than rage: clarity. As the hearings progressed, as the community grappled with the uncomfortable truths, Willow continued to rebuild. She returned to work. She reconnected with people Drew had shut out. She wrote, she spoke. She lived without filters. And though the scars were still there, memories of touch that didn't feel real, of choices that weren't truly hers, she carried them like armor. She no longer needed Drew's protection. She didn't need permission to feel. And most of all, she didn't need to be forgiven for what she never consented to. The obsession that once defined her life had been severed. Drew's narrative collapsed. And from the wreckage, Willow emerged not as a victim, but as the author of her own reality. Her body was hers again. Her mind was hers again. And her voice, once lost in a sea of compliance, was louder than ever. The war was over. And she had won.